In 1800, there were 1 billion people, and it took 250,000 years to get there. It only took 12 years to add the latest billion. In 2050, there will be 9 billion people on Earth. I'm going to cover a massive topic relatively quickly, so I'm going to present some ideas for you to go away and think about. An argument, as you know, is a collective series of statements intended to establish a proposition. My proposition is there are sustainable ways to house 9 billion. I believe there are some seemingly logical steps to take, and there are some potentially very dangerous steps. You'll need to think exponentially in a world that thinks in mainly linear way about many of the technologies that I'm going to talk about. I think we're currently at the very heel of exponential change, about to tip upwards very steeply with change. David Suzuki said the world is currently suffering from an infestation of humans. This is the plaque in Weymouth, England. The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people. The secrets of our genetic code are being cracked every day, so an event on this scale of the Black Death may not be likely anymore to control our population. Other species seem to have natural balances that control their numbers, like myxomatosis arguably has done for rabbits, for instance. The UK population as of Monday, the current world population as of Monday. We currently live on a planet which has 7 billion people on it, when we can only sustain some 1 billion from sustainable sources. The rest are currently living off ancient sunlight, fossil fuels laid down millions of years ago. It's worth noting here that China and India each have 4 times more people than the US, and remember that for later on. By 2050, 6 countries, China, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan and the US, are expected to have populations of more than 300 million. The report suggests that Africa alone will drive more than half of the world's population growth over the next 35 years, during which time the population of 28 of the continent's countries will more than double. It's predicted by 2050, Nigeria's population will surpass that of the US, making the West African nation the 3rd most populous country in the world. It's not an increase in fertility that's driving the growth, it's longer lifespans. Globally, people born today are expected to live to the age of 70, but people born in 2050 will live to 77. Regardless of whether the population winds up exceeding, hitting or dropping below the numbers predicted, one thing is certain: we will all need to learn to share. An interesting point sometimes made about family sizes in developing countries is that educating girls and young women reduces population growth. But world population is not the whole story. Energy use per person, this is. I should point out that red is bad. We're all guilty of conspicuous consumption. I'm guilty, I know, mea culpa. I currently drive a Land Rover, but the next car I drive will be a green one. Conspicuous consumption refers to people who buy expensive items to display wealth and income rather than cover the real needs of the consumer. A new iPhone when the current one still works fine, new trainers when the new model comes out, etc. With 20% of the world's population consuming 80% of goods and services produced from the Earth's resources, it's imperative and logical that we should try and become more efficient with our energy use in the West. Some would be shocked to learn that Australians come second after the US as energy users per capita. This is due to all the mining, of course. And that's a map detailing many of their mining concerns that really tipped up in the 60s. If we look at the total population created by each country, we find that China is way out in front. Its progress is fueled by mainly burning fossil fuels. So this is the total emitters of pollution. But if we look for per capita emissions for greenhouse gases, Canada come up at the top, surprisingly. Have you ever noticed that your iPhone or your computer ceases to work quite as well just before a new version is released? This is called planned obsolescence or built-in obsolescence in industrial design and economics. It's a policy of planning or designing a product with an artificially limited use of life. So it will become obsolete, that is unfashionable or no longer functional after a certain period of time. And we have to ask the questions, is this really acceptable nowadays? Industrial designers are a big part of the current environmental problem, but we are also part of the solution. This is the iconic blue marble, Western Hemisphere photo taken from 1972 from Apollo 17 as it left the Earth for the moon. The fact is you can no longer throw things away because there is no away, Jeb Beringer once said. And we live on a very small planet. There will be more plastic in the sea than fish by 2050, says the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. With the breakdown of plastics in the ocean to smaller and smaller pieces, it's getting into our food chain. This is the sea currents taking plastic to 5 main areas in the oceans. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, also described as the Pacific Trash Vortex, is a gyre of marine debris particles in the central northern Pacific Ocean. And our atmosphere, it said our biosphere is like a peel in relation to the size of an apple. China's air pollution is so awful that you can see it now from space. The World Health Organization reckon that 1 in 8 deaths worldwide are directly related to pollution at the moment. And we can't tell the poor of India, China, Brazil that they can't have the same products that they see on TV. However, if everyone lives a Western lifestyle, there will be catastrophic consequences for the earth. And this is where design comes in. We have to adopt, then export more environmentally friendly ways of living to the rest of the world before Brazil, India and many other developing countries all want to develop the same way as China has done using fossil fuels. A number of waste prevention techniques are available. They're commonly summarized as the so-called 4 R's: reduction, reuse, recycling and recover. So as you go down the triangle, less and less material is used until there's only a small percentage that goes to landfill. These are all areas that we can help as a designer. We need to think about cradle-to-cradle design when we put pen to paper and start designing. Can it be separated easily? Can we use recyclable materials? Are they from a sustainable source? Can we limit the mixture of materials in one product? We need to look carefully at planned obsolescence, as we've already said. Metals can always be recycled infinitely. Wood is carbon neutral, so it can be burnt to recover the heat at the end of its use. Plastics gradually degrade each time they're recycled, although we should always try to use thermoplastics instead of thermosetting plastics. And the DT students among the room will tell you what the difference is between a thermo and thermosetting plastics. And it's not long since George Bissell was looking for an alternative to whale oil to fuel his lamps. He found it in 1859 in Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. This is from the NASA website, and it's data taken from ice core samples taken from the last 650,000 years. The Earth's climate has changed throughout history. Just in the last 650,000 years, there have been 7 cycles of glacial advance and retreat, with the abrupt end of the last ice age at about 7,000 years ago, marking the beginning of the modern climate era and of human civilization. Most of these climate changes are attributed to very small variations in the Earth's orbit that change the amount of solar energy our planet receives. And on the NASA website, you'll read that scientific evidence for warming of the climate system is unequivocal. I believe that we'll need cross-party agreements about very many upcoming critical changes. Short-term politics, our 5-year current cycle, is not capable of the necessary changes. We had an example of the potential of this kind of cooperation with 195 countries coming together for the climate talks in Paris in December. The Marshall Islands, along with hundreds of other islands, including the island of Utila, where some of you dived last summer with Operation Wallacea, will disappear with just a 2-degree temperature rise. US President Obama said that if the world keeps warming as fast as it is, and sea levels rising as fast as they are, and weather patterns keep shifting in more unexpected ways, then before long we're going to have to devote more and more of our economic and military resources not to growing opportunity for our people, but to adapting to the various consequences of our changing planet. Unfortunately, earlier this week he also said, this is not just Mr. Trump. There's not a single candidate in the Republican primary that thinks we should do anything about climate change. This is slightly worrying. I'm just hoping that this is a political statement more than anything else. At the UN at the moment, one in every 122 people is displaced by war, violence and persecution. That's what according to the UN. 1 in every 122. 60 million plus are currently refugees, internally displaced or seeking asylum. If these extraordinary powerful images of Syrian children washed up on a beach in Turkey don't change Europeans' attitude to refugees, what will? Unfortunately, many people estimate that these scenes of 60 million plus refugees will be dwarfed by climate change migration if we do not tackle the effects of global warming. Ultimately, without being more thoughtful about the use of the Earth's resources, the following things become a real potential. Fuel wars, mass migration of peoples and animals, failing crops, flooding, drought, extremes of weather. Poor people in the developing world always suffer first as well. We had some of the early indications of changing weather patterns, partly due to global warming this Christmas. These were the Somerset levels. And we first had Storm Desmond, then Storm Eva struck the UK on the 23rd of December, Storm Frank in the last few days of December. And if you look here, this is the average line here, and these are all above average. So that's the average above in the UK in January. This here is the average above for England. And this next one, South and East and Central, here's the average here, and that's 267%. The British public is kind of evenly split on the role of climate change in the current floods. But scientists have made it clear that global warming brings rain, rain brings floods, and floods bring damage. It's not just climate change, however. El Niño, which happens approximately every 5 years, was also to blame. So I'm not saying it was just entirely down to climate change. For the last 20 years, I've been taking expeditions to the jungles and mountains of the world. This was from the first expedition in Borneo 21 years ago. And it kind of really opened my eyes to a lot of expeditions and to environmental problems on those expeditions. Although only 2% of the Earth's surface, rainforests house 99% of all species, accounting to over 5 billion species. This is central Kalimantan, right on the top of the spiritual home of the Dayak tribe. And this is the ominous site of the logging road, on the logging road. And this is a very rough estimate. 2 mature trees can provide enough oxygen for a family of 4. Yeah. And then it goes down the rivers. And everything I've seen, I've just shown you that on these pictures, is now palm oil plantation. Everything. We flew for a couple of days in a light aircraft over the jungle, and everything I'd seen for 21 years had gone. And we're all connected from one side of the planet to the other now. Weather patterns are changing, yet we still chop trees down on the other side of the world. This is palm oil, and the fruit from the palm oil gets collected, put on ships, and some of the products containing palm oil from illegal sources, you'll see on a daily basis over here. So we're directly contributing to cutting down the rainforest. And it's also being used for fuel as biofuel, which is complete madness, as you'll see from later on. This is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many people think that helping developing countries travel up this triangle using sustainable technologies, that we can limit and manage the amount of pollution and damage done to the planet. The first things to address are the basic physiological needs of developing countries, as seen at the bottom of this model here. Oops, let's go back, it's all right. That one here, the physiological needs here. I'm going to talk to you about the basic needs now, which are water, food and air, the basic survival necessities. We'll also look at the developing countries and how we can live more sustainable ways. At the moment, 1 American uses the resources that 20 people in some parts of Africa use, which again is totally unsustainable. Just as a disclaimer, I should point out that over the next few slides, I want to make you to be aware that I'm aware of the Gartner hype cycle. I'm reasonably happy that I've done my research, but it's always tempting to be swayed by hype. The World Health Organization shows that 900 million people worldwide have a readily available supply of drinking water. 3.5 million people die annually because of diseases resulting from the consumption of unsanitary water, making it the leading cause of disease and death around the world. Most of the victims are young children, the vast majority of which die from illnesses caused by organisms that thrive in water sources containing raw sewage. Despite the fact that over 2/3 of the Earth's surface is covered with water, only 1% of it is drinkable. This is an example of nanotechnology already in use. This is a lifesaver bottle. It's a portable water purifying device designed by Michael Pritchard from Ipswich. The bottle filters out objects larger than 15 nanometers. 1 nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. Bacteria can get through meshes of 200 nanometers, but viruses can. So now they can't. It can even filter urine, although not dissolved salts or ions. And he's had a few problems with this year, so we'll have to watch this space. But rather than bottled water, surely these should be sent to disaster areas instead. This is an extremely cheap, simple way to get salt out of water. Desalination is usually a hugely expensive and environmentally costly process. But this simple clay still just needs sunlight to render brackish water drinkable. For about 1/10 of the world's population, at least 880 million people, a reliable supply of clean water remains out of reach. And for a big chunk of those 880 million people, there's water nearby, but it just happens to be seawater and full of salt. This solar still works on the same principles bootleggers used to make moonshine during Prohibition. Evaporate a liquid with heat and then collect the condensation and what's left over. It uses the sun's energy to evaporate unpurified water into vapor, then condenses it into water on relatively cool interior surfaces of the pottery. This fresh, purified water runs into a basin below and is removed to be carried home, with salt and other contaminants being left behind. This is the same idea, but running on any combustible fuel. Slingshot is a water purification device invented by the designer Dean Kamen. Kamen's best known for inventing the Segway. It's powered by a simple Stirling engine running on a combustible fuel source. It claims to be able to produce drinking water from any source by means of vapor compression distillation. It requires no filters and can operate, as I said, using cow dung as a fuel. You might have seen Fontus as well, which just won the James Dyson Design Prize this year. It's a self-filling water bottle for your bicycle. This device collects the moisture contained in the air, condenses it and stores it as safe drinking water. Powered by solar cells, it can harvest up to half a litre of water in an hour's time under the right climate conditions. It's quite good. The seawater greenhouse provides a low-cost solution by enabling year-round crop production in some of the world's hottest and driest regions. It does this using seawater and sunlight. With populations increasing by approximately 80 million a year, a third of the planet will likely face water shortages by 2025. This looming water crisis is inexorably linked to food production because agriculture accounts for 70% of all fresh water used, and obtaining irrigation water in arid regions has serious environmental impacts. As seawater is evaporated at the front of the greenhouse to create cool, humid conditions inside, a proportion of the evaporated seawater is then condensed as fresh water that can be used to irrigate the crops. This technology was introduced by British inventor Charlie Patton in the early 1990s, and it's now being developed by his UK company Seawater Greenhouse Limited. The cool and humid conditions in the greenhouse enable crops to grow with very little water. When crops are not stressed by excessive transpiration, both the yield and the quantity are higher. The simplicity of the process imitates the hydrological cycle, where seawater heated by the sun evaporates, cools down to form clouds, and returns to the earth as rain, fog or dew. Tenerife and Dubai are currently evaluating these, and they've got up and running systems. And it all looks pretty good so far. The amount of water we use for farming is not only harming the environment, it's also not sustainable. As I've said, agriculture consumes 70% of the freshwater resources globally and up to 90% in some parts of the world with fast-growing economies. In conventional farming, it only takes 28 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of lettuce. Aeroponics is the most water-efficient farming method in use today. The roots are not in soil, but in a mist of water vapour and nutrients. It uses 70% less water per plant than hydroponics, and hydroponics uses 70% less than traditional farming methods. So using aeroponics takes growing crops from 70% of use of water to 6%. Vertical farming uses controlled environmental agriculture, and it's where all the environmental factors can be controlled. These facilities utilise artificial control of light, environmental control and humidity, temperature and gases, and fertigation. Some vertical farms use techniques similar to glass houses, where natural sunlight can be augmented with artificial light and metal reflectors. And I should point out that fertigation, if you didn't know, is the injection of fertilisers, soil amendments and other water-soluble products for an irrigation system. These are the advantages of vertical growing using aeroponics in cities. You get year-round crop production by growing crops inside controlled environments, and crop production is not dependent upon the seasons then. You don't know weather-related crop failures. You have no agricultural runoff. By growing in a controlled environment, these toxic chemicals are unnecessary. You have allowance for ecosystem restoration out in the countryside where you usually grow crops, so allowing nature to recover. You've got no use of pesticides, herbicides or fertilisers. There are no weeds to pull in hydroponic or aeroponic systems, which is pretty impressive. It uses 6% of water, as I've said. It greatly reduces food miles. The average distance food travels from farm to table is 1,500 miles. Vertical Farms proposes growing food in the centre of cities, drastically cutting this distance down. There's more control of food safety and security. The vertical farm is designed using the same equipment hospitals use in intensive care units to prevent pathogens and pests from affecting the crops. Security is proposed to prevent people from sabotaging this environment. And there are new employment opportunities. When farming exists in a skyscraper, there are plenty of jobs. The traditional farmer goes through stages. They buy their seeds, they till the land, fertilise, plant, maintains, harvests and then sells. In the vertical farm, the crops exist in all of these stages all of the time, necessitating the need for labour. At the moment, this, may be too expensive. But as we get more and more crowded on the planet, it will make more and more sense. Edward Wilson from Harvard University said that the constraints of the biosphere are fixed. Aside from the limited availability of fresh water, there are constraints on the amount of food that the earth can produce. Growing grain for livestock is an ineffective way to convert plant energy into food energy. If everyone agreed to become vegetarian, leaving little or nothing for livestock, the present 3.5 billion acres would support about 10 billion people. This 3.5 billion acres would only feed 2.5 billion US omnivores. However, because much of the vegetation is dedicated to livestock and poultry in the United States. This is the land needed to produce 1 kilo of food. Bit of a difference, isn't there? It takes 200 times more water to make 1 pound of beef than a pound of potatoes. This is a butcher in Mumbai and an abattoir. 26% of the land surface of the planet is occupied by livestock grazing. 33% of the cropland is used to feed livestock. Livestock contributes to 18% of global warming effects. This is Dutch scientist Mark Post with samples of in vitro meat or cultured meat grown in the laboratory, and this is at the University of Maastricht. This process involves taking a muscle cell biopsy or embryo cells from a cow in the case of beef and applying a protein that promotes tissue growth. Once this process has been started, it's theoretically possible to continue producing meat indefinitely without introducing new cells from a living organism. In August 2013, Professor Mark Post unveiled the world's first hamburger made entirely of lab-grown meat. Fashioned from 20,000 strands of muscle fibre, the prototype cost a staggering $250,000 to make. But as the advances of technology come on, Post burgers should be so cheap that they become standard in fast food outlets around the world. The low price, the safety and the eco-credentials should win over the food industry and consumers alike. Moving up the Maslow's triangle, we get to safety and protection from the elements and how developing countries are thinking of ways to meet this challenge. This is shelter box operations, and the shelter box operation director is a mate of mine who's an ex-Marine. His name is John Leach. They come complete with everything a family needs, including communication devices, GPS, and everything, so they can be taken for emergency situations around the world. This picture comes from when Shelter Box was deployed to Kenya following drought and famine across the Horn of Africa in early 2011. This is another design that's becoming more prevalent. Concrete canvas shelters are rapidly deployable, hardened shelters that require only water and air for construction. Concrete canvas shelters have two major advantages over conventional tented shelters. They enable a hardened structure from day one of the operation. They provide much better environmental protection, increased security and vastly improved medical capabilities to set up hospitals and things in areas. Concrete canvas shelters have a design life of over 10 years, whereas tents wear out rapidly and must then be replaced. So the concrete canvas shelters are a one-stop solution, saving effort and cost over the lifetime of medium to long-term operations. 3D printers have been out on the market for a long time now. We've certainly been teaching it in design for the last 20 years. And typically they print small objects using some sort of plastic filament. A 3D printer called Big Delta has been unveiled, and it's so massive that it can imprint entire homes out of mud and clay. The giant 3D printer is 40 feet tall and was built with the goal of making houses that are almost no cost to construct while using as little energy as possible. The designers behind this project aim to use it to build quick and cheap housing in disaster areas and to address future housing needs in a growing world population. And in a first, the Chinese companies advanced this 3D printing by printing 10 houses entirely out of recycled materials in just under a day. There's some pictures from here. Quite incredible. And we've got massive advances in materials that will all play a part. Aerogel, as you can see here, has the lowest thermal conductivity of any known insulation material. And you can see the material now is available like this in rolls of insulation for buildings. So if you're building anything at the moment, it's a must. Aerogel is a sort of foamy glass. Both are silicon-based solids, yet aerogel is only 0.02% solid by volume. The rest is empty space. Weighing just 3 times as much as aerogel has earned itself the nickname frozen smoke. And amongst its many claims to fame are 15 entries into the Guinness World Book of Records. Of course, you can expect to see every material 3D printed very soon. This guy has a 3D printed titanium mesh, part of his skull. This 3D printed bionic ear, it hears frequencies that a human can't. So it's got benefits over the original. This is a 3D skull, and this was implanted recently into a 22-year-old Dutch girl. Aldi has now started selling 3D printers in Australia in its stores. Mattel is selling the Thing Maker for $299 so kids can start making their own toys. So if I move on to energy now, I'm going to talk about the changes in the way that we use energy and the type of technologies we should be exporting to the developing world as well as adopting for ourselves. The sun strikes every square metre of our planet with more than 1,360 watts of power. In 14.5 seconds, the sun delivers more power than all man needs for 24 hours. The cost of solar power dropped 50% last year alone. You may have seen this chart before. It's the most important solar chart, really. It shows just how quickly solar has dropped in price. It shows the reason that solar will soon dominate. Because it's a technology, not a fuel. So as time passes, the efficiency of solar power increases and the prices fall. In 17 years' time, it will be cheaper than coal. As early as 2018, solar could be economically viable to power big cities. By 2040, over half the electricity may be generated in the same place it's used. Centralised coal-fired power is over. Last month, for the first time in living memory, the wholesale price of electricity in Queensland, Australia, fell into negative territory in the middle of the day when there's most demand. The impact has been so profound that few coal generators in Australia made a profit last year. State-owned generators are specifically blaming rooftop solar. This graph, the one we're all used to, until fairly recently, will be unrecognisable. So forget that one. And clear photovoltaic cells mean that every window and every electronic screen will produce electricity soon. One of the problems has been storage. Most good rechargeable batteries only live for 4,000 to 5,000 cycles, for instance. This is the Tesla Powerwall. The Powerwall is a home battery that charges using electricity generated from solar panels and powers your home when the sun goes down. This is Elon Musk with the battery. This guy is a South African-born Canadian-American business magnate, engineer, inventor and investor. He's the founder of CEO of SpaceX, co-founder, CEO and product architect of the Tesla Motors. And he also co-founded PayPal, where he made his first millions. This graph shows the estimated yield from proposed aluminium air batteries. Fuji just announced very recently that they've cracked the aluminium air battery. And aluminium air batteries produce electricity from the reaction of oxygen in the air with aluminium. An electric vehicle with aluminium batteries has the potential for up to 8 times the range of lithium-ion battery with a significantly lower total weight. The biggest remaining challenge is storing electricity that interacts with the grid. The latest technology to grapple with this issue is the liquid metal battery. It seems that most battery innovations have been emerging from academia rather than commercial R&D at the moment. And this is from researchers at MIT have been working on a liquid metal battery system that could enable renewable energy sources to compete with conventional solar plants. The research for this has been funded by the likes of Bill Gates, energy giant Total, the US Department of Energy's Advanced Research Projects Agency, and Sun Microsystems, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems. This is a really interesting one. You may have seen this on the news very recently, only last week. This is the world's biggest concentrated solar storage plant, and it's now up and running in Arizona. It uses a big vat of molten salt to store energy from the solar power overnight. The power plant produces about 900 gigawatt hours of electricity a year. They gather enough sunlight to power 70,000 homes. It was only opened in October 2013, and it's a zero carbon power plant that could underpin the energy grid of the future. A parabolic trough solar collector system can warm tubes of oil to tremendous temperatures. And typically the one in Arizona, this is our oil pipe that runs here, and it's in the center of our parabolic mirror, and it focuses it onto this pipe. And that pipe goes all the way around the system up to 400 centigrade, goes into a big vat of salt where it brings up the temperature to 500 centigrade. It's surrounded by, guess what, aerogel, nice insulative, and it stays there overnight, turning water into steam, steam turning the turbines, and turbines producing electricity. And that's always all through the night, and it's a very, very, very efficient system. The Anasol power station is a 150 megawatt concentrated solar power station, and this is Europe's first commercial plant to use parabolic troughs. It's located in Andalusia in Spain. Just moving on to nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a hell of a way to boil water. That was Albert Einstein. Indeed, nuclear power is just that, a way to boil water to create steam that turns turbines to generate electricity, just like I was saying a second ago. Because of the radiation involved, though, it happens to be the most dangerous and expensive way to generate electricity. The industry claims that nuclear power is green and clean. However, vast amounts of conventional fossil fuels go into mining uranium for fuel, crushing and milling the ore, enriching the uranium, creating the steel and concrete for the reactor, decommissioning, dismantling and cleaning up afterwards the reactors, transporting and storing the thermally and radioactive hot nuclear waste for up to 500,000 years, without any of that leaking or seeping. Besides using fossil fuels, each stage of the process emits radiation. The transport of nuclear waste involves moving it through highly populated areas and in severe weather conditions. There is no known way to store the radioactively contaminated waste safely. The health effects on radiation are well known. Cancer and birth defects are part of the spectrum, and no dose of radiation is safe. And all radiation is cumulative within the body. Albert Einstein said the splitting of the atom changed everything but humans' mode of thinking. This is Fukushima in Japan in 2011. It was caused by an earthquake 130 kilometers offshore and then a tsunami. You know, they did build it in a place that was called the Ring of Fire. I mean, you know, I think there was a clue there. Even a quick comparison of Fukushima and Chernobyl, which was in '86, the nuclear accidents show it to be the worst nuclear accident ever. 70 to 80% of the radioactive cesium was dropped straight into the Pacific Ocean. Radioactive contaminants from Fukushima are carried across the Pacific Ocean by currents and spread along the west coast of North America by complex coastal processes. And the radionuclei hit the west coast of America in 2014. On the west coast of America, the levels are low. They are very low. They are below the safe drinking water levels, however. But the same thing can't be said of near the plant. There's still a 20-kilometre exclusion zone all the way around it. Some species like bluefin are far-ranging and even migrate across the Pacific. So when these animals leave the northwest coast of Japan, some isotopes remain in their body, but others, like cesium, naturally flush out of their system. Most marine life that's been contaminated from Fukushima remains near the reactor, it has to be said. So, yeah. Dr. Tatsushima Kadoma, the director of the Radioisotope Center of University of Tokyo, he said that the amount of radiation released thus far is equivalent to 29 Hiroshima-type atom bombs. Because of the radiation involved, it's the most dangerous and expensive way to generate electricity. I'm not against nuclear power, however. We currently mostly run what's known as second-generation reactors in the world. There are some first reactors still in operation. I want to go straight to generation 4 reactors, missing out generation 3 altogether, which will be possible in about 20 years' time. Many people want to phase out all the generation 1 and 2 reactors as soon as possible, for all the reasons I've just shown. As we design and research new products, however, new materials are invented along the way. So it's really, really important thing that we keep this scientific aspect going. And for instance, carbon nanotubes coming from this are the strongest and stiffest materials yet discovered in terms of tensile strength and elastic modulus, respectively. And I'll refer to these later on as far as computing. Transparent aluminium is already here. Once it comes down in price, we'll be able to look through our car and see it working. See all these things just happening that we had never thought possible before. Graphene is 100 times stronger than the strongest steel, 100 times. It conducts heat and electricity efficiently and is nearly transparent. So research in all these areas of science must continue to further scientific understanding. I mean, we may need all these things for propulsion into space. I mean, Stephen Hawking said recently that I don't think we'll survive another 1,000 years without escaping beyond our fragile planet. We must continue to go into space for the future of humanity, he added. I want to encourage public interest in space. But once we spread out into space and establish independent colonies, our future should be safe. Interesting stuff. This area I'm going to go through the largest. This is the largest area of change, really, within 2 generations. Before I came into teaching, I used to design cars. My boss, Bill Towns, he designed the Aston Martin Lagonda, and he used to say that the petrol engines shouldn't really work, but they've been tinkered with by engineers for so long that we've just made them work. But engines like this one are massively inefficient at turning chemical energy from petrol into movement. They're only a staggeringly 24%, something like that on average, efficient. Ridiculous. The Tesla S here has autopilot with auto steer. It's an electric all-wheel drive. It does 0 to 60 miles an hour in 2.8 seconds. And it's got over 330 miles in range. One thing people haven't said about electric cars, and they've not said it at all, is they're really easy to produce and manufacture in comparison. So electric cars like the Tesla Model S, the Renault Zoe, the BMW i3 can recharge their batteries at quick charging stations within 30 minutes to 80%. And that's going up and up and up and up and up all the time. This is a good example. The electric vehicle sales in the US. Autonomous cars capable of sensing its environment and navigating without human input, detecting surroundings using radar, LiDAR, GPS, odometry and computer vision are going to be here very soon. These are all referred to as level 4 cars, and an electric car with all that kind of technology on, I think an F1 car, driverless car, will beat a driven F1 car within the next 7 years. So if everybody wants to take me up on that bet, I'm willing to make it, okay? The other massive question mark is, what are the millions of patents that are locked up in all the many petrol companies' safes? So much research and development and design that has been held back because of oil. IBM's Watson supercomputer wowed the tech industry in 2011, winning against 2 of Jeopardy's greatest champions. And cognitive computers don't think by themselves, but they're capable of learning. They can adopt to new information, they can interact, and they can propose solutions. And the technology has been getting very, very fast since 2011. So what's it do? Well, it analyzes unstructured data. So it uses natural language that we might speak to it for processing to understand grammar and context. It understands complex questions, so evaluates all possible meanings and determines exactly what's being asked. It presents answers and solutions based on supporting evidence and the quality of the information found. So what are the benefits to mankind? Well, you can have Maasai tribesmen today in Kenya rely on their cell phone technology. Access to technology via WOCM can change the direction of a whole society. Just like the Arab Spring, revolutions are now planned on Facebook, use Twitter to coordinate them, and YouTube to broadcast them to the world. And with the smartphone revolution, an increasingly powerful new set of tools, from attachments that can diagnose an ear infection or track heart rhythms to an app that can monitor mental health, can reduce the use of doctors, cut costs, speed up the pace and give more power to patients. So you can test your blood sugar on your iPhone here. You can manage your diabetes and share the results with your doctor. You can collect and analyse blood tests at a patient's bedside to diagnose infectious and other diseases. Watson and other similar systems, as one from Google at the moment as well, can help unlock life-saving insights from cancer patients' DNA. Getting all that unstructured data and analysing it. They can help perform remote robotic surgery, saving money and saving lives. It's a bit of a silly, but it's actually taking place. There's a hysterectomy that was on recently that they performed remotely by a robot. Just last month, a milestone for artificial intelligence, AlphaGo beat a human champion 5-0 at the 3,000-year-old Chinese strategy game Go, that requires intuition rather than brute processing power to prevail. The system honed its own skills through a process of trial and error, playing millions of games against itself till it was battle ready, and then surpassed even its creators with its prowess. And Google DeepMind, which is the British artificial intelligence AI company, the computer defeating a professional human player at this was thought to be at least a decade off. And Moore's law shows no sign of stopping anytime soon, when materials like graphene, nanoribbons on the horizon. These nanoribbons are 15 atom-wide graphene strips that could potentially increase the number of transistors on a chip by more than 10,000 times. This is something that needs talking about. The richest 62 people are as wealthy as half the world's population. Or half of the world's wealth is now in the hands of 1% of the population. And the gap is widening. So it's of paramount importance that individuals are seeing the need to give back to society. Mark Zuckerberg, doesn't matter what you think about it as a proposal, but he's exploring the ways to use aircraft to beam the internet to remote regions in Africa. And we were talking about that and the explosion of population there and the need for a sustainable growth. So communications, we've seen, is key in developing countries' sustainability. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the largest philanthropic organisation in the world and is committed to, among other things, the eradication of malaria and polio and controlling the spread of tuberculosis and HIV around the world, founded by Bill and Melinda Gates, obviously. And this $43.5 billion trust, for instance, wants to tackle the 20% of HIV rate in South Africa, for instance. 20%. Outrageous. And small groups of people are currently changing the world. It tends not to be the large groups and corporations anymore, although corporations may buy out the smaller firms. Radley, for instance, is slow and steady. It's not particularly nimble in terms of modern businesses. We're risk adverse. We've got much to lose. So it's kind of understandable, but you really need to look at all the modern business models that started really in the Toyota car manufacturers back in the 70s. However, taking risks is an indispensable part of creativity. So to conclude, so you can all go to burger night, if we make the right choices and learn to collaborate, the future does not have to be bleak. If we make the right decisions, we can live successfully on Earth and move out to populate other planets. But it'd be wise to remember that with great power comes great responsibility. Thank you very much.